In October 1492, the Arawak people of the Bahama Islands encountered a phenomenon they could not have anticipated. Towering ships, strange figures in metal armor, and an array of objects utterly unfamiliar to them. Emerging from their villages, they swam out to meet these newcomers with curiosity and goodwill. Their reaction was marked by gestures of generosity. They brought food, water, and gifts to welcome the visitors who spoke an alien tongue and carried peculiar tools and weapons. The American historian Howard Zinn paints this moment not as an encounter of equals, but as the beginning of exploitation. The Arawaks, he writes, were a communal people, living in harmony with their environment, cultivating cassava, yams, and corn, and crafting with simple but effective tools. They had no iron, no war horses, and no familiarity with the instruments of European conquest. Their vulnerability was obvious to Christopher Columbus, who recorded in his journal that with 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. This statement, Zinn notes, reveals the foundational mindset of the European arrival, one of dominance, commodification, and extraction. To Columbus and his crew, the Arawak's adornment with small gold ornaments was a sign of hidden wealth, a promise of the riches that they had ventured westward to claim. Yet the reality was starkly different. The gold that Columbus sought was scarce in the region, but this did not deter the imposition of brutal systems to exploit both the land and its people. What began as an exchange of gifts quickly devolved into an imposition of force. Columbus noted the Arawaks' lack of weapons, observing with astonishment how they mistook the sharp edge of a sword for a tool and injured themselves in their ignorance. "They do not bear arms," he remarked. To Zinn, these words underscore the tragic mismatch between the two cultures. One predisposed to cooperation and sharing, the other driven by a relentless thirst for wealth and power. In that fleeting moment of initial contact, the Arawaks offered the hand of friendship, a gesture that would not be reciprocated. Their openness, their hospitality, their very way of life, everything that had defined their society, was, for the Europeans, an opportunity to be seized, not a culture to be respected. As Zinn narrates, this first meeting foreshadowed the larger narrative of conquest and subjugation that would follow. The driving force behind Columbus's expedition was not exploration or cultural exchange. It was gold. This precious metal had become the symbol of wealth and power in 15th-century Europe, a resource that could fund wars, secure alliances, and elevate nations. Spain, recently unified under Ferdinand and Isabella, was desperate to compete in this global race for riches. Columbus, in turn, promised untold treasures from the lands he believed lay across the Atlantic. Upon his arrival in the Bahamas, Columbus fixated on the gold ornaments worn by the Arawaks. Though these were small trinkets, they were enough to feed his ambition. He immediately began asking where the gold came from, and when he did not find the vast reserves he had envisioned, he grew increasingly determined. He took Arawaks aboard his ships as captives, coercing them to act as guides to what he believed were the sources of this elusive wealth. In his report to the Spanish crown, Columbus inflated his findings, describing fertile lands and gold-filled rivers. "There are many wide rivers of which the majority contain gold," he claimed. This was part fact, part fiction, an embellishment aimed at ensuring further support for his expeditions. What followed, Zinn notes, was the establishment of a brutal system of exploitation. On the island of Hispaniola, Columbus forced the native population into servitude. The Arawaks were required to collect gold, even though it was scarce and difficult to extract. Failure to meet quotas resulted in severe punishments, often mutilation or death. The effects of this gold-driven system were devastating. Entire communities were destroyed. As Zinn starkly observes, they died in great numbers. By 1515, there were perhaps 50,000 Indians left. By 1550, there were 500. As Columbus and his men settled in Hispaniola, they laid the groundwork for a systematic structure of exploitation that would define European colonization. This was not an incidental outcome, but a deliberate strategy to extract wealth and resources from the land and its people. Howard Zinn describes how Columbus, with the remnants of his fleet, established Navidad, the first European military base in the Western Hemisphere. This fortification symbolized more than a foothold. It marked the institutionalization of a system designed to subjugate. The foundation of this system rested on forced labor. Columbus and his men began compelling the Arawaks to work in search of gold. Those who resisted were met with brutal violence. Entire communities were subjected to quotas for gold production, an impossible demand given the limited natural deposits in the region. Punishments for failing to meet these quotas were barbaric. Mutilation or execution became common. The psychological and physical toll on the indigenous population was catastrophic. The oppression was not limited to labor. Europeans used their superior weapons to instill fear and assert control. Armed with swords and muskets, the Spaniards carried out massacres to suppress resistance and assert dominance. This violence, combined with the introduction of European diseases, decimated the Arawak population at an alarming rate. Zinn illustrates how these mechanisms of control set a precedent for colonial rule. The Spanish crown formalized systems of forced labor, such as the encomienda, which would replicate the exploitation of the Arawaks across the Americas. This institutionalized violence, Zinn argues, was not a product of individual cruelty but a calculated structure to extract maximum resources with minimal regard for human life. The establishment of this system was a stark reminder of the transformative and devastating power of European imperialism. What began with a single military base evolved into an enduring pattern of domination, fundamentally reshaping the Americas and erasing countless indigenous lives and cultures. The events surrounding Columbus's expedition were not isolated but deeply embedded in the broader currents of European expansionism in the late 15th century. This period marked the rise of centralized nation-states like Spain, which were emerging from internal consolidation and seeking opportunities for wealth and influence beyond their borders. Howard Zinn contextualizes Columbus's actions within this expansive drive, fueled by a combination of economic ambition, religious zeal, and political necessity. Spain, recently unified under Ferdinand and Isabella, had spent decades expelling the Moors and asserting Catholic dominance. This unification came at a cost, leaving the kingdom financially strained and in need of resources to maintain its power. Gold, increasingly seen as the measure of wealth in an evolving global economy, became the primary target. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 closed overland routes to Asia, forcing European powers to look westward for new paths to riches like spices, silks, and precious metals. Portugal had already begun exploring maritime routes around Africa, but Spain gambled on Columbus's proposal of a westward passage to Asia. His voyage was not an act of individual curiosity but a calculated investment, one framed by the royal promise of wealth, governorship, and glory. The backing of the Spanish crown reflected the broader European pursuit of competitive advantage, where each kingdom sought to outmaneuver rivals in securing trade networks and resources. The ideological justification for this expansion was as important as the material incentives. Rooted in the Christian doctrine of spreading the faith, European colonization was cloaked in the language of divine mission. Zinn emphasizes how this religious framework served to rationalize conquest and subjugation. Indigenous peoples were viewed not only as obstacles to economic gain, but as heathens whose lands and labor could be appropriated under the banner of Christianization. Zinn also highlights the structural shifts in Europe that supported this expansion. The Renaissance had brought advances in navigation, shipbuilding, and cartography, making transoceanic expeditions feasible. The economic transition from feudalism to early capitalism created new pressures to accumulate wealth and resources. In this context, exploration was not just an opportunity. It was a necessity to sustain the emerging nation-states and their ambitions. Columbus's actions, Zinn argues, were emblematic of this broader European ethos. His relentless pursuit of gold and his establishment of systems of exploitation were not deviations but reflections of a wider pattern. European expansion was rooted in a worldview that prized accumulation, dominance, and the erasure of cultures that stood in the way of these goals. The conquest of the Americas, initiated under Columbus, became a proving ground for the methods and ideologies that would define European imperialism. Reassessing the narrative of Christopher Columbus involves challenging the traditional portrayal of his arrival in the Americas as a heroic milestone in human progress. Howard Zinn argues that this widely accepted version of history, which elevates Columbus as a pioneering explorer, is fundamentally flawed. It glorifies conquest while marginalizing the catastrophic consequences for indigenous populations. By centering on the lived experiences of the oppressed, Zinn reframes the story of Columbus as one of invasion rather than discovery. The Arawaks, described as generous and hospitable, are not portrayed as passive victims but as human beings with agency, dignity, and a rich cultural heritage. Their treatment under Columbus's regime, enslavement, forced labor, and annihilation, is not an unfortunate side effect of progress but the direct result of a system driven by greed and imperial ambition. We'd love to hear your thoughts on possible future topics. What areas of human evolution would you like to explore next? Leave your suggestions in the comments, and let's keep the conversation going. As always, our references and further reading are listed in the description below if you'd like to dive deeper into the subject. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode. And do not forget, subscribe to The Knowledge.